Feels like it's been a little while since we dipped into John's gospel record. But we're coming in on a unique section, I guess, in the gospel overall. First of all, we're coming into the last 6 months of Jesus' life on earth already. Like I pointed out, maybe it was last Wednesday, that most of John's account covers only the last week of Jesus' life. So it doesn't take long in a reading through or a study through of the Gospels to get to at least the second half of Jesus' life, and then, or not life, but ministry. And then once we get to the second half of Jesus' ministry, then that's pretty much right near the end of his life already, his life on earth, that is. And we are coming in to that point now. Last 6 months or so, it was the time when he was going to head to Judea. Now, he wouldn't remain there until the end of his life, once he goes there, but he would go there and he would leave a few more times, but he wouldn't go all the way back to Galilee every time. He would go to some other areas, and we're going to see that trip to Jerusalem here. One of these significant trips to Jerusalem here in John's account, John chapter 7. Then we're going to see some lessons about discipleship. And we'll see a little bit more about that journey to Jerusalem in Luke's account, Luke 9, 51 through 56. And then we'll see some things about discipleship at the end of Luke chapter 9. Speaking of which, some questions to start us off, some food for thought maybe. What is required to be a disciple of Jesus? What does it take? Don't answer, just think about it. Let it marinate. What does it require? What is required of a person in order for them to be a disciple of Jesus? Now, we're not necessarily talking about what do you have to do to become a Christian, because while there is some overlap, or they're similar, there's also a little bit more to the idea of being a disciple of Jesus. Now, I would argue and submit that you can't really be a Christian and not be a disciple of Jesus. However, the word disciple does have a little bit more to it, a little bit more involved in that. So what is required to be a disciple of Jesus? Is there anything required beyond obeying the gospel? And is there ever a time when the Lord would say, yes, I understand that's something that's important for you to do. You go ahead and you go take care of that first before you become my disciple or before you follow me. Just consider. Do you think there's any circumstance in life where Jesus would say that? You're right. Go do that, and then you can follow me. Then you can become my disciple. Tonight's lesson, we're going to look at two different texts, and we'll review one of them as well. So, first we're looking at Jesus going to Jerusalem. His ministry overall is going to be traveling over or down to Jerusalem. We would say down, they would say up to Jerusalem, because you have to go up to go to Jerusalem. So, I've tried to get myself to stop saying down to Jerusalem, but I can't, because I'm not one of them. So when I look at a map and I see south, I want to say down. But Jesus is going to be traveling there to the Feast of Booths. You might know, or you might even have a different name for this feast in your Bible. What is this feast? Maybe the more traditional name of this feast. The Feast of Tabernacles. I don't really have a preference, but Feast of Booths kind of sounds funny to me, but that's because a booth could mean several different things. But this feast was one of the three main feasts that were instituted in the Old Law. There were three, and at these three feasts, every male, Jewish male, I guess of a certain age, was required to go to Jerusalem. No matter where they lived in the land of Israel, in the land of Canaan or in Israel, they had to go to Jerusalem these 3 times a year. Just a little side note, the fact that they did this 3 times a year is a wonderful illustration of God's providence and care for the nation of Israel, because they had every single man 20 years old or upward, or whatever the age cutoff was for these feasts at least, all in Jerusalem 3 times a year. And at least one of these feasts, if not multiple of them, lasted several days, a week. If you were an enemy nation and you wanted to attack Israel, that'd be a really good time to do it, don't you think? Hey, all the men are at Jerusalem. If we, besiege Jerusalem, we've got everything. All there are women and children and maybe some elderly people and everywhere else, but never happened because God took care of them as they were doing what He told them to do. What are the other feasts, by the way? Oh, no, it's not showing up there yet. Anybody remember the other 2? You got one freebie. All right, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that's one. It's Passover, the Passover. And Pentecost, which is called the Feast of Weeks. The Feast of Unleavened Bread obviously celebrates the passing over of those obedient Israelites, or Hebrews rather, in that final plague in Egypt. Feast of Weeks celebrated the culmination of the Exodus at Mount Sinai. It occurred 7 weeks and 1 day after the Passover, 50 days. That's why it's called Pentecost. And then the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, which was a week-long feast, had a twofold purpose. One was to commemorate the giving of the law, and the other was to renew the covenant that was made between Jehovah and Israel on that occasion. So here's what we read in John chapter 7, verses 1 through 9. After this, very vague terminology there, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill Him. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. So His brothers said to Him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you're doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even His brothers believed in Him. Jesus said to them, "My time is not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I'm not going up to this feast, for my time is not yet fully come." After saying this, He remained in Galilee. But after His brothers had gone up to the feast, then He also went up, not publicly, but in private. It should say through verse 10, actually, even though it says verse 9. So, Jesus remained in Galilee. We already knew that. That's what we've been for quite some time now. Jesus had been remaining in Galilee. And John goes ahead and explains the reason that He was ministering in Galilee for so long is because he couldn't, you could say, go to Judea because it was a little too hot there, spiritually speaking or figuratively speaking. It was too risky because the people there, the Jewish leaders were there, and they were really seeking to kill Him, and it wasn't time for that. So He didn't go there. But He still had the obligation, right, as a Jewish male of a certain age, to go to Jerusalem at least 3 times each year for these feasts. Now, the interesting thing about this occasion is that we get to see His brothers. We don't see them very often. And I'm sure there could be different people, and probably have been people that want to look at that word brothers and say it doesn't necessarily mean his siblings, but I don't know if there's a strong case to be made. It's just naturally that's the most natural interpretation, the most obvious interpretation there. They said to Him, now they hardly ever show up in the narrative so far, have they? We've seen them whenever they came to get Him. Remember when they thought He lost His mind? His mother and His brothers were there. Now we see them again. I'm going to shut this if that's okay with you. Maybe it's not bothering you, but it's bothering me. Indulge me. Now, the fact that they thought that Jesus had lost his mind earlier would sort of lend itself to the idea that they didn't really believe that he was who he is. Don't you think? Even though his mother did, and she was there to get him too, doesn't necessarily mean that she also thought he had lost his mind, because she clearly knew better. But now we see them, and it may be confusing on the surface. They go up to Jesus, their big brother, half-brother, but brother, not half-brother in the sense of most half-brothers or half-siblings that we would know today, because he would have been exactly like they were as far as in the family. Now, they said, "Leave here and go to Judea." Where's here, you think? Well, go back up to verse 1. Galilee. "Leave Galilee and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you're doing." In other words, your disciples elsewhere, not just up here in Galilee, but your disciples wherever they are. "For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly." Now, as far as a strict logical perspective is concerned, they got a point, don't they? If somebody wants to be known openly, why would they work in secret? Isn't that's common sense? If you want to be known openly, that's silly. Somebody that would work in secret when they want to be known openly, that's just not how it's done, and nobody would do that. The people that want to be known openly go out and work openly. They do things openly. Now, why were they saying this to Jesus? Well, because they had perceived, or they had observed, or at least in their opinion, Jesus had been working in secret. Remember, not very long ago, the scribes had challenged him, and not for the first time, not for the last time, to do a sign from heaven. Show us a sign so everybody will know, everybody here will know. And what did he do? He didn't do anything as far as doing a sign. He just said, "Nope, not going to do it. I'll just give you the sign of Jonah." And it wasn't the kind of sign they were expecting, because it wasn't a sign at all. It wouldn't be a sign until sometime later. Well, his brothers, whether they had witnessed that or not, they surely would have heard about it and other similar things. So their reasoning is sound, I guess, as far as that goes. What was the purpose of him doing these works if he's doing it in private and just, and in his immediate circle of apostles, or in a house, or in some remote district out in the country somewhere, before a multitude of people that don't really know much? That's definitely how the other Jews would have viewed them, ignorant. No greater sin than being ignorant, as far as they were concerned. Well, if he wanted to be known openly, and notice this, if you do these things, I don't want to be unfair to them, but what John tells us in the next verse certainly lends itself to interpret verse 4 in the more negative light. But it certainly sounds like they're questioning whether he does those things at all, don't you think? If you're doing these things, if you're really doing these things that people are talking about, go and show yourself to the world. Now, remember when Peter said, "No, Lord, that will never happen to you. You're not going to Jerusalem to be killed." And that was very similar to the temptation that Satan had offered him in the wilderness. One of the temptations that were represented there about, "I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world, and you don't have to go to the cross. You don't have to die. You don't have to have a horrifying, excruciating death. For one kingdom, I'll give you all of them. And all you have to do is join me." Well, this sounds an awful lot like another one of those temptations. pinnacle of the temple, jump down. God will save you. He'll have to save you. And he even quoted Scripture from a psalm, at least took it out of context. God will save you, and look, all those people down there, they're going to believe in you. How could they not? That's very similar to this. Show yourself to the world. Everybody will accept you, believe you. And I can't help but think that the reason that John included the statement in verse 5 was to help us to understand why his brothers were saying this. Because if without that, we might expect them that they believed in him and they're wanting him, out of the goodness of their hearts, out of their faith and belief in their brother, that they want him to be accepted and believed in by other people. But the fact that John tells us they did not believe in him sort of changes this whole situation, doesn't it? What was their motive? Let me tell you what I think was not their motive. I do not think it was their motive to get their big brother killed. And some people have seen that in this. That they were basically telling their big crazy brother to go down there and do this stuff because they knew that it would get him killed. I don't know if that's fair. I don't know if it's fair to go that far. Whatever their motive was, maybe they just didn't want him to go with them, or maybe they wanted him to go, I don't know, maybe they wanted to be separate from him, whether they were saying come with us right now or maybe just come with this big party of travelers, whatever it was. Based on the text alone, all we can say is the reasoning was sound, but they didn't believe in him. So why were they saying this other than maybe just even mocking him even, or just their motives may not have been so pure. At any rate, we know that Jesus, just because John tells us in verse 1 that Jesus wouldn't go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him, doesn't mean his brothers knew that. So they were maybe challenging him, and since we're having to read their words and we can't hear their words, tone and things like that, whether there was any, laughter or scoffing or anything like that, we're just not told. All we're told is, for not even his brothers believed in him, which seems to connect that with what they just said. So their motives were clearly not the purest, whatever they were. And it's a sad statement, John 7, verse 5. Not even his brothers believed in him, because that almost also implies that, or reminds us that the majority of people did not believe in him. Or else the language is a little confusing. Not even his brothers believed in him. So not only did all these people not believe in him, not even his own brothers believed in him. Well, what did Jesus reply? Time's not come. Your time's always here. The world can't hate you, but it hates me. And this is another significant statement. Why did the world hate him? He's going to tell his disciples, the apostles, later, the world's going to hate you because they hate me. And if you're mine, the world's going to hate you. They hate me, so they'll hate you if you're with me. But here he goes ahead and he says why the world hates Jesus. Why does the world hate Jesus? How could anybody hate Jesus, by the way? I don't care who you are or what you believe in. If you just learn about the man Jesus, even if you want to just believe he was a man, look at his teachings. He himself said you can know a teacher by his fruits. Well, look at Jesus' fruits. How can anybody hate? But Jesus says the world does hate him, and why?
He wanted everybody to change.
Okay.
People want to stay and do what they want to do. They don't want to change and do all the different things. It's more different today than it was back then.
Yep, he instructed change. Why change, though?
Because they were doing the wrong thing.
Okay, they were wrong. They were in the wrong. The world hates me because I testify about it, that its works are evil. That's why they hate him, because he says that what they're doing is evil. By the way, if Jesus testified that the works of the world are evil, we ought to be doing it too. Now that's not to say that we ought to be going to every single person that we find and say, you are a sinner and you better straighten up. You're going to hell if you don't change. But we can testify about the works and how they're evil. And Paul instructed that same thing. Don't take any part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but expose them. Expose them. When the church starts ignoring sin, the slope gets real slippery. And we may be seeing the effects of that. And that goes for preachers and anybody else too. Ignoring sin and not talking about not just how bad sin is, but what is sin. What kinds of things are sinful, and pointing those things out. And it's up to the person to make the change. Now there are times when people should be approached directly. That's what the brethren are supposed to do. That's what we looked at that Sunday night about when your brother sins against you, go to him, tell him his fault. That's exactly what that is. So the world hates me, he says, because I testify about it that its works are evil. But then what does he say? Okay, he says, you go on. But then what does he say? This is where it gets real tough as interpreters or as readers, students. He says, I'm not going because my time hasn't come. So, they said, come, go on. He said, nah, you go on. I'm not going. But then what's he do? Well, two things. John says, first of all, he remained in Galilee. What does that mean? If it wasn't for the next verse, it'd be simple. If we stop at verse 9, it's not difficult at all because he said, no, you go on, I'm not going, and he didn't go. But then verse 10 says, after they went, then he went. What's this? Did Jesus lie to his brothers? How do we explain this? How do we explain the seeming discrepancy between Jesus' words and his actions? Well, a couple of options. Number one, he meant, I'm not going up to the feast in the manner which you have suggested. That is, I'm not going to go and be make a show out of myself and be flamboyant about it, and as you're implying or saying that I should. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that he's saying, I'm not going yet.
Yes.
And I'm not going. Yeah.
Yet is what gives it away. You didn't say I'm not going. You said I'm not going when you want. I'm not going right now.
Yeah, some English versions actually include the word yet, and that's because some of the manuscripts also have the word yet, but all of them don't. Not all of them have that, and I think it's the minority that do have that, but they may have included it because it's implied, more or less. But even without the word yet, I think John's statement at the end of verse 10 sort of supplies the explanation. It may not be the best explanation or the most exact and explicit we would hope for, but he says he also went up not publicly but privately. And I think even as an unbeliever who doesn't believe in the sinlessness of Jesus, it would only be fair to interpret that statement as or to accept that statement as an interpreter of Jesus, what Jesus said. I'm not going now I'm not going to go with you. I'm not even going to go with this traveling group, because that's the way they would travel to the feast, the people from Galilee. And Alfred Edersheim at least said that because of the distance between, in time that is, between the last great feast that they would have observed and this, there would have been more sacrifices that would have been due, and they would have been leaving ahead of time more than usual and traveling slowly. And they would travel in big groups because that was the safest way to travel. If it wasn't the quickest way, it was the safest way, and maybe the most convenient in a lot of ways. But Jesus he's not going with them. He's not going to go with their group. And he's certainly not going to go in the way his brothers are saying he ought to go. But he tells them to go ahead and go on. My time has not fully come. And even in that statement, it's different than the first thing he said, my time has not yet come, which we would automatically interpret that the same way he meant it when he told his mother that at the wedding feast. My hour has not yet come. It's not time for that. But then when he said, I'm not going because my time hasn't fully come, he may have simply been referring to his time to go to the feast, for all we know. What we do know is that he went. He didn't go, but then he went. So it seems putting it all together, he was simply saying, I'm not going right now, you go on. All of y'all go on. But then he went with his small band of his close circle, his immediate circle, his apostles. He didn't go publicly, but privately. Why did he go privately? According to verse 1. Verse 1 doesn't say why he went privately, but it applies. Because it was dangerous, right? The Jews were seeking to kill him, so they may have been looking for him in the traveling party from Galilee and whatnot. So not only did he not go with them, but we're going to learn from Luke's account, which Luke does not tell us about these preceding details, but he does tell us about the trip itself. John doesn't tell us about the trip itself, but only the preceding details, and the opposite is true with Luke. So this trip to Jerusalem then, we can flip over to Luke's account and get some information about that. Luke chapter 9. And this is a unique section. It's been pointed out that from Luke 9:51 all the way to chapter 18, verse 14 is alone, stands alone as far as the other three gospel records are concerned. But that same scholar pointed out that it fits perfectly with John's account. As far as blending them together, it fits right in there. So this section, Luke 9:51 through 18:14, supplies the record of what happened before and during and after the three journeys. John mentions 3 trips that Jesus made to Jerusalem. And this section in Luke tells us about what happened before those 3 trips, during those 3 trips, and after those three trips to Jerusalem that John tells us about. And this is the beginning of that, what we just read with his brothers. So they're going to Jerusalem, right? He wasn't going to go in the manner that they suggested, and he wasn't even going to go with their traveling caravan, but he went in private. Beginning in verse 51 of Luke chapter 9 says, when the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. Now here's how we know that he didn't even go the same direction or the same route. We've talked about in the past, especially in the context of John 4, the Jews would not usually go through Samaria. They would go all the way across the Jordan River and then go down, south that is, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, which is outside of Israel. They'd rather go outside of Israel altogether than to go through Samaria. And then they would cut back west to go up to Jerusalem, specifically to avoid Samaria. Because the Jews, John tells us again, for the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Well, on that occasion, Jesus specifically went back north, back to go home through Samaria. This time he's specifically going through Samaria to go south to Judea. But first he sends messengers on ahead that would travel more quickly to try to secure some hospitality. Don't know why they would need to try to stay there, but that was the plan. So, it was a long journey after all. Verse 53 says, "But the people did not receive him, because his face was set toward Jerusalem." What does that mean? His face was set toward Jerusalem. What's that? He was traveling toward Jerusalem. Now, it wasn't because literally his face was set towards Jerusalem. They didn't want to, after all, he sent messengers there first. It wasn't about Jesus' actual face or anything like that. They knew he was going to Jerusalem, and if he's going to Jerusalem, that means he's a Jew. And even though, to us, and probably to the Romans for sure, the Samaritans were Jews. I mean, they can't tell the difference. And they would seem the same to us. Not to them, though. That's why that Samaritan woman said, "How is it that you, a Jew, are talking to me?" So the fact that this company and Jesus himself had their faces set toward Jerusalem, we don't want you here. You're not welcome here. The fact that they were going to Jerusalem would almost like stir the pot of discord between them about going to Jerusalem versus, here at Mount Gerizim and that kind of thing that the Samaritan woman brought up to Jesus. Well, as shocking as it may be, the Samaritans rejected Jesus. You can't stay here. Last time we saw Jesus in Samaria, it was a wonderful, beautiful thing. That woman went in there to the village and told everybody, and they came out running. Could this be the Christ? Things have changed. He was en route to Jerusalem, their rivals, and therefore he was not allowed to stay there. Well, if we get a little picture of the personality and character of James and John now, because we haven't really seen this side of James and John, and we really never will again. They didn't like this too much. It says, "And when his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, 'Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them?'" Some manuscripts say, "as Elijah did," and that should remind us of Elijah when the king kept sending out these soldiers of 50 with their captain and to get him out of that cave, and every time he called fire down from heaven and consumed them. Not every time, just the first 2 times. So they sort of were inspired by that and asked Jesus for permission, requesting permission to do what Elijah did and burn this Samaritan village to the ground.
It must have been pretty bad. The rejection must have been pretty bad if you're saying that.
You would think if it was that, it may be that some of their prejudices have crept in here too. If a group of Jews rejected Jesus, maybe they'll just brush the dust off their feet and move on. But Samaritans, they don't get away with it that easy, yeah. But it may have been ugly. They may have been real ugly about it. They may have been disrespectful. At any rate, James and John,
I think it shows a little bit that their faith had grown, though.
their faith had grown in Him.
And His ability or in their ability to trust in Him and to pray to God and receive what they want, receive what they ask.
Yeah, that's another thing about this is, did James and John really think that did they have confidence in themselves that they could do this if they wanted to? Or were they asking Jesus, for permission to be able to do it and just volunteering themselves, we'll do the work, or whatever, like somebody might volunteer to do something that the other person could do, but you want to do it instead, or give me the honor of doing it. Maybe that's what it was, and not just that they had the confidence, like anytime I want to call down fire from heaven, I can if I want. But at least they asked permission. But again, I think it's because they knew they wouldn't be able to unless He wanted them to. So the only thing Jesus cared about at this point was the fact that they even wanted to do that. So his reaction to them was that He turned and rebuked them. We don't have any quote. We just have the straight fact that he turned and rebuked them. And I can't help but imagine that put their tail between their legs pretty quick. But remember the nickname that Jesus gave them? Sons of Thunder. Well, they lived up to that name this time, didn't they? If not before, they did here. Sons of Thunder. Boy, I'd say so. It's a pretty good nickname. They were fiery. And that is shocking. We don't know much about James, but we do know quite a bit about John. And this doesn't sound like John, does it? This is not the John I know. John's the disciple of love. He talked about love more than anybody. Almost every single quote of Jesus about love, John is the one that recorded it. And then almost every New Testament quote about love, John recorded it. He's the one that wrote it in his letters. 1 John mainly. And he refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. So he's just got love all over the place. He didn't on this day. No love for the Samaritans. All they got was fire.
Maybe he matured. Maybe at one time he was like that.
Yeah, this may have been a turning point for him. Can't help but think it was a turning point. He learned a lesson. Jesus turned and rebuked them. Some versions or some manuscripts have a quote of Jesus here, but whether it's genuine or not, I wish there was a little bit more. I would like to hear what more he might have said. Some of the manuscripts include him saying, "You don't know what manner of spirit you are, for the Son of Man came not to destroy people's lives, but to save them." Yeah, that's true, strictly speaking. But the better manuscripts don't have that quote. But it would have definitely struck a chord with them that he turned and rebuked them for suggesting this. This was another personal thing. Remember, John had already spoke up to Jesus and said, "Hey, we saw this man casting out demons, and he wasn't with us, and we told him to cut it out." And Jesus said, "Don't do that." Well, here, I wouldn't call that a rebuke, but this was a rebuke. Whatever he said, this was a rebuke, and they were needing to hear this. But it says a lot about Jesus, doesn't it? They rejected him strictly out of prejudice. Again, John says the reason was because he was going to Jerusalem. That's why they rejected him, wouldn't receive him, because that told who he was, or what he was, what they were, and that's why they didn't let him stay there. But he said, "No, I don't want you to do anything to them." It will be similar to in the garden. You know, one of them said, when we put all the accounts together, one of them, an unnamed disciple, asked. But then all of a sudden Peter's already pulling his dagger out and he's trying to do something. I don't know what he was trying to do. But it was not wise. And Jesus, if the circumstances had been a little different, he would have probably whirled on Peter and rebuked the fire out of him. But instead he healed that man's ear. I don't want you to do anything like that to these people. Even though they're taken to have a mock trial and to kill me. No, stop. And here, I don't want you to do that. That is not the way I want it to be or the way it should be. That would be powerful lesson not only for James and John, but for the Samaritans too, don't you think? If they witnessed this, if they witnessed him rebuking his own disciples who want to do them harm, that would be powerful. Somebody would have had to have been moved by that, even if they didn't change their mind about letting them stay there. So they went on to another village, exactly as he instructed them when they went out. If somebody doesn't receive you, shake it off, declare that you're moving on, and move on to the next house or the next village or whatever. So he showed them by example that same instruction. So here they go. As they were going on the road, this is verse 57 then. As they were going along the road, someone said to him, I will follow you wherever you go. Jesus said to him, Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. That's the end of that one. We don't get the rest. But our lesson, it points out, we got 3 prospects of would-be disciples. First one is impulsive. Came out maybe a little too hot, a little too bold. I'll follow you wherever you go. And I think, it seems to me, the implication is that he didn't go with Jesus. Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere. Did he go with him? We don't know. A 50-50 chance, but I'm not sure if the implication is the positive one. Another person showed up, but Jesus called this one. Follow me. But he said, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. And Jesus said to him, leave the dead to bury their own dead. But as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God. Now remember that question we asked at the beginning? Is there ever a time when Jesus might say, yes, that's totally understandable. You go ahead and do that first and then come follow me. If there was ever a time when Jesus would ever say that, this is the one. Would you agree? Let me go bury my father. Just put yourself in a position where somebody, I don't know, you have a plan with somebody or something, or you're in a position of authority at a workplace and somebody calls in and says, my father died, or my dad's funeral's today. You would consider that an excused absence, wouldn't you? Of course. But Jesus says, you let the dead bury the dead. Might be a little bit of a head scratcher. Seems to be maybe a play on words, at least. The spiritually dead bury the physically dead. As for you, you go and proclaim the kingdom of God. Maybe worth pointing out, we don't even know if this man's father had died yet. He could be dying, and so a considerable amount of time may be implied. Their ceremonies that they observed in those circumstances would have been like a week long also, and other considerations than as being as simple as my modern day illustration. But Jesus knew this man's heart. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But anytime a decision needs to be made between conflicting duties, if we want to be Jesus' disciple, we got to put him first. We got to take that from this. And I would, while being as compassionate as possible, I would also suggest that we read of other examples in Scripture, in Old and New Testament, when people were in tremendous amounts of pain and grief, and where they were driven to go was not home, but to God's house. And I think that's a powerful example for us too. There should be no better place that we want to be in times of pain and grief than at God's house among God's people. Not always that easy. Sometimes, and our personalities vary as well, we may want to be alone. Not everybody always wants to be around people. Yeah.
I had people get upset with me over my mother passing, and she passed, and we buried her on a Sunday. And she was a Christian, member of the Church of Christ, and she knew she was dying, and she told all of us to go to worship, And my father had the ceremony, and he placed it on a Sunday. And I don't know why he did, but anyway, we so many people asked me why we were there. And I said, this is where my mom would want me to be, and this is where I'm supposed to be. This is where God wants me to be.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, it's unfortunate that people would get upset with you for being at worship.
One of my siblings did. He thought I should be there.
Yeah,
We just, after it was over, we went back.
yeah. You still left a good example, though. Even if it upset him, it definitely struck him as something. Even though he didn't like it, it still made an impression. And the more time that goes on, his thoughts on that might change, and other people would certainly be impressed. I know I would be impressed if I'd witnessed that, and I'm impressed just to hear about it. But yes, I think you did the best possible thing. You didn't totally neglect that, but you balanced it out, and beautifully so, I would say. Yep, exactly. As this, we could make an application out of this statement of Jesus. Very good. Then another final person came and said, I'll follow you, Lord, but let me first say farewell to those at my house. Jesus said to him, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. So, what lessons can we learn from this very quickly? Discipleship to Jesus has a price. There is a price. Now, I would submit with all due respect that the church may have historically placed, and for lack of a better way to put it, too much emphasis on baptism, if that's possible. And part of the reason for that is because there are so many groups who claim to be Christian groups who de-emphasize baptism, and that sort of leads us to want to emphasize it more in response to their lack of emphasis on it. And it's the same thing with other issues. When somebody's teaching a falsehood about that issue, we want to be more louder and clearer about the truth of that issue. However, what that ended up turning out to cause is a lot of people getting baptized without understanding what the cost is, that there's a price, there's a cost, and that's why they're baptized, and then before long, we can't find them anywhere. They're totally MIA. We can't. They're unable to be located. So, before someone makes that vow, you got to count the cost, and we need to do that with them. Explain this is a very serious thing. It's important. It is not, thank you, Lord, for forgiving my sins. Now I'm going to go on my way and live my life. But when we obey the gospel, we're making a vow to God. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 5:4 and 5 that it is better to not even make a vow to God than to make a vow and not pay it, because God does not take that well. He doesn't have pleasure in fools, he says. And Peter said, 2 Peter chapter 2, that it'll be better for somebody, if somebody obeys the gospel and then goes back into their life of sin, it'll be better for them. It would have been better for them if they never believed in the first place. And that is a very, very strong and powerful statement for us to remember, because that would apply to people who frivolously let somebody baptize them, but then they don't really have any intention of obeying or following Jesus. But it is a vow, a pledge. We're pledging ourselves to Him and our allegiance to Him, if you will.